My brother-in-law Marcus looked me dead in the eye across my own dining table and said, "Victoria, you're completely useless. I don't know why we even bother including you in family gatherings anymore." The words hit me like ice water, especially coming from someone sitting in my house, eating the Thanksgiving dinner I'd spent 3 days preparing. 22 people had gathered around my table that Thursday afternoon, and every single one of them heard him say it. What Marcus didn't know was that the useless woman he was insulting controlled more wealth than his small mind could comprehend. And I was about to teach him exactly what happens when you mistake quiet strength for weakness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I had been hosting Thanksgiving for the Henderson family for 8 years running, not because I particularly enjoyed the chaos of feeding 24 people, but because I had the largest house, and, frankly, the deepest pockets to make it memorable. My late husband David had left me well provided for when he passed 5 years ago, though most of the family had no idea exactly how well provided. They saw a quiet widow in her early 50s who kept to herself and seemed to live modestly. They had no clue about the international business empire David and I had built together, or the carefully structured offshore accounts that generated more passive income in a month than most of them earned in a year. The Henderson family had always treated me like the poor relation, despite the fact that I was funding half their lives. My sister Elena, Marcus's wife, constantly made subtle digs about my simple lifestyle, while conveniently forgetting that I'd paid for their daughter's college tuition. My nephew Bradley acted like I was invisible unless he needed money for his latest failed business venture. Even my elderly mother-in-law Ruth had developed a habit of making passive-aggressive comments about how I wasn't living up to my potential since David died. But Marcus had crossed a line that afternoon. The conversation had started innocently enough, with various family members sharing what they were grateful for. When it came to my turn, I had simply said I was grateful for family and the opportunity to host everyone. That's when Marcus decided to unleash his venom. "Grateful for family?" he had scoffed, his face already flushed from the wine I'd provided. "What exactly do you contribute to this family, Victoria? You don't work, you don't have kids, you barely leave your house. You're just taking up space at this point." The table had gone silent. My sister Elena looked mortified but said nothing to defend me. Bradley actually smirked, clearly enjoying the show. Even sweet cousin Margaret seemed uncomfortable but didn't speak up. That's when Marcus delivered his final blow about me being useless. I had smiled politely, excused myself to check on dessert, and spent 10 minutes in my kitchen planning his destruction. Not emotional destruction, financial destruction. The kind that would teach him and the rest of my ungrateful family exactly who they'd been taking advantage of all these years. You see, Marcus worked for Henderson Industrial Solutions, a mid-sized manufacturing company that my late husband and I had quietly acquired a controlling interest in 3 years ago through a web of shell companies and offshore partnerships. Marcus had no idea that his paycheck ultimately came from me. But more than that, Henderson Industrial was on shaky ground financially, propped up primarily by several lucrative contracts that could disappear at any moment. Contracts that were controlled by companies I owned outright. As I served the pumpkin pie I'd made from scratch, watching Marcus laugh with my nephew about what a charity case I'd become, I was already mentally reviewing the portfolio of businesses and investments that would allow me to systematically dismantle his comfortable life. The beautiful thing about offshore financial structures is that they provide both incredible power and complete anonymity. Marcus would never see me coming. The next morning, I called my financial advisor in Switzerland. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Henderson." Klaus greeted me in his precise English. "I trust you had a pleasant holiday?" "Enlightening," I replied. "Klaus, I need you to review our position in Henderson Industrial Solutions and all related subsidiary agreements. I'm particularly interested in the McKenzie Group contracts and the Morrison Steel arrangement." There was a pause as Klaus pulled up the files. "Ah yes, these represent approximately 60% of Henderson Industrial's revenue stream. Both contracts are renewable annually, with the next review scheduled for January. Is there something specific you need regarding these arrangements?" "I want them terminated," I said simply. "All of them. Effective immediately where possible, or at the earliest contractual opportunity where notice is required." Klaus cleared his throat diplomatically. "Mrs. Henderson, This action would likely result in significant financial distress for Henderson Industrial. The impact on employment would be substantial. I'm aware of the consequences, I said. Please proceed with the terminations, but ensure they're structured to look like routine business decisions rather than targeted actions. I want this to appear as natural market forces, not personal retaliation. Of course. And the timing? I want the first contract termination to hit by December 1st. Space the others throughout December and January. Make it look like a trend rather than a coordinated attack. After ending that call, I contacted my attorney in the Cayman Islands. Sarah Mitchell had been handling my offshore legal affairs for over a decade, and she understood the delicate art of corporate maneuvering. "Victoria," she said warmly, "what can I do for you today?" "I need to review our holdings in the Chicago area real estate market," I said. "Specifically, properties in the Riverside Hills subdivision." I could hear Sarah typing. "We have several properties in that area through the Pacific Holdings Trust, including a rather nice colonial at 47 Maple Street. That's the one I'm interested in. What's the status of the current lease?" "Month-to-month rental agreement. The tenants have been there for 2 years. Excellent payment history. Is there an issue?" "No issue with the tenants themselves," I said carefully. "But I'm going to need that property vacant by January 1st. Please begin the proper legal procedures for non-renewal of the lease. Make sure everything is done by the book. I don't want any complications." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Victoria, this is rather sudden. These tenants haven't done anything wrong, and January is not an ideal time to relocate a family." "I understand your concerns," I said, "but this is a business decision. Please ensure they receive proper notice and perhaps include a relocation assistance package to ease the transition. I'm not trying to be cruel, just decisive." The property in question was Marcus and Elena's rental home. They'd been living there for 2 years, blissfully unaware that their landlord was the same woman Marcus had called useless. The irony was delicious. Over the next few days, I made several more strategic calls. I contacted the board of directors at Riverside Community Bank, where I was a silent partner through another shell company. Marcus had a rather substantial personal loan with them, secured against his expected bonuses from Henderson Industrial. When those bonuses disappeared due to the company's declining fortunes, that loan would become problematic. I also reached out to my connections in the luxury car leasing industry. Marcus drove a BMW that he loved to show off, financed through a company that happened to owe several favors to businesses in my portfolio. A few strategic conversations about creditworthiness and payment reliability would likely result in some uncomfortable conversations for Marcus in the near future. But the crown jewel of my revenge plan involved Bradley, my nephew, who had found
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Marcus's performance so amusing. Bradley had been running a small consulting firm that was hemorrhaging money faster than he could borrow it. He'd been pestering me for months about investing in his company, and I'd been politely declining. What he didn't know was that his 3 biggest clients were subsidiaries of companies I controlled. Their contracts were up for renewal in February. The first domino fell exactly as planned. On December 2nd, Marcus came home looking shell-shocked. Elena called me that evening, her voice tight with worry. "Victoria, I hate to bother you, but Marcus got some terrible news at work today. They lost their biggest contract with the Mackenzie Group. Apparently, Mackenzie decided to go with a different supplier for cost reasons. It's going to mean layoffs at Marcus's company." I made appropriate sympathetic noises while internally celebrating. "Oh no, that's terrible news. Is Marcus's job secure?" "We're not sure," Elena admitted. "He's middle management, so he might be okay, but they're talking about cutting salaries across the board. We're really worried about making our rent next month." "I'm sure things will work out," I said gently. "These business cycles happen all the time." "I keep thinking about what Marcus said at Thanksgiving," Elena continued, her voice breaking slightly. "He was so stressed about work, and he just took it out on you. You didn't deserve that. You've always been so good to our family." This was the first acknowledgement I'd received that Marcus's behavior had been inappropriate, and it came only because Elena was scared about their finances. I wondered how different the conversation would have been if their money troubles hadn't materialized. 2 weeks later, the second domino fell. Marcus came home with an eviction notice. Through the Pacific Holdings Trust, I had formally declined to renew their lease, citing plans to renovate the property for sale. The notice was completely legal and gave them the required 30 days to vacate, but it couldn't have come at a worse time for their finances. Elena called me in tears. "Victoria, I don't know what we're going to do. We got notice that our landlord isn't renewing our lease, and with the uncertainty at Marcus's job, no one will approve us for a new rental. The references we've been getting from current landlords aren't helping either." Of course they weren't getting good references. I'd made sure that inquiries about Marcus Henderson would generate responses highlighting his recent employment instability and debt-to-income concerns. All factual, all legal, but devastating for someone trying to secure housing. "That's awful," I said. "Do you need help looking for places? I could make some calls. Would you?" Elena sounded so grateful it almost made me feel guilty. "We're getting desperate. We've looked at over 20 places, and everyone wants first month, last month, and security deposit up front. With Marcus's reduced hours, we just don't have that kind of cash available." I offered to help with the search, knowing full well that their housing options were limited by the financial profile I'd carefully crafted for them. Every apartment complex and rental agency they contacted would see the same concerning picture: employment instability, high debt ratios, and recent financial stress. The few places that might consider them would require deposits and terms that stretched their budget to the breaking point. Meanwhile, Henderson Industrial continued its downward spiral. The Morrison Steel contract termination hit in late December, followed by the collapse of their Beaumont distribution deal in early January. Marcus went from reduced hours to unpaid leave as the company struggled to stay solvent. His BMW was repossessed on a Tuesday afternoon while he was inside a coffee shop attending yet another job interview. The beautiful thing about systematic financial destruction is that it looks completely random to the victim. Marcus had no idea that his world was collapsing, due to the coordinated actions of the woman he'd called useless. To him, it appeared to be a series of unfortunate coincidences and bad luck. His company lost contracts due to market forces. His landlord wanted to renovate. His car loan company tightened their credit standards. His brother's consulting clients decided to go in different directions. By February, the Henderson family was in full crisis mode. Marcus had been unemployed for 3 weeks and was living in Elena's sister's basement. Bradley's consulting firm had folded after losing all its major clients within a 2-week period. Even cousin Margaret was feeling the pinch, as the property management company she worked for, another business in my portfolio, had restructured and eliminated her position. The only family member seemingly unaffected was me. In fact, I appeared to be thriving. I'd started volunteering at the local art museum, joined a book club, and had even begun traveling again. I made sure to post photos from my trip to Switzerland on social media, showing myself at charming cafes and luxury hotels. Not to be mean, but to demonstrate that while their world was falling apart, I was living my best life. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus had accused me of being useless and not contributing to the family, yet I was the only one whose life was stable and improving. But then again, he had no idea that I was the architect of his misfortune. Elena finally swallowed her pride and called me in March. "Victoria, I know this is asking a lot, but we're in real trouble. Marcus has been unemployed for 2 months, we're living in a basement, and we can't get approved for anywhere decent to live. I was wondering if you might consider lending us some money to get back on our feet." "How much are we talking about?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be substantial. "Maybe 15,000? Just to cover deposits and first few months of rent somewhere, plus some basic living expenses until Marcus finds work." $15,000. Less than I typically spent on a weekend trip, but for them it represented salvation from their current nightmare. I let the silence stretch for a moment, enjoying the power dynamic that Marcus had been so eager to mock. "Elena, I wish I could help," I said finally, "but I'm not really in a position to lend that kind of money right now. My financial advisor has been very strict about keeping my spending under control since David died." It was a complete lie, of course. I could have written them a check for 10 times that amount without it affecting my monthly budget. But Marcus had made it clear that he viewed me as useless and expendable. I was simply returning the favor. I understand, Elena said, though her voice made it clear she didn't understand at all. It's just that you always seemed so generous before, and we thought maybe times change. I said gently. We all have to adjust our expectations. After I hung up, I sat in my home office surrounded by the quarterly reports from my various international holdings. The revenge had been more satisfying than I'd anticipated, but it was time to move to the final phase. Complete financial and social destruction wasn't the goal. Education was. I wanted the Henderson family to understand the consequences of taking people for granted, and to appreciate what they'd had when they had it. But I also wanted to give them a path back to stability, provided they demonstrated that they'd learned from their experience. The question was whether Marcus was capable of genuine reflection and change, or if his arrogance ran too deep for redemption. I picked up my phone and called Klaus in Switzerland. I want to create a new business entity, I told him. Something that could hire Henderson Industrial's former employees and take over their client base. But I want to structure it so that the leadership team has to demonstrate specific qualifications and character traits before being considered for positions. An interesting approach, Klaus said. What qualifications are you considering? Humility, I said. The ability to acknowledge past mistakes and demonstrate genuine appreciation for opportunities. I want to create a situation where Marcus has to humble himself completely if he wants to rebuild his career. And if he refuses, then he can enjoy the consequences of his choices indefinitely. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would create a new company that offered Marcus everything he'd lost: a good job, financial stability, and the chance to rebuild his reputation. But getting that opportunity would require him to publicly acknowledge his mistakes and demonstrate that he'd learned from them. He would have to specifically apologize to me for his Thanksgiving behavior and explain what he'd learned about judging people by their circumstances rather than their worth. If he was too proud to humble himself, he could remain unemployed and homeless. If he was willing to grow as a person, he could have his life back and then some. The choice would be entirely his. 3 weeks later, Elena called with excitement in her voice for the first time in months. Victoria, you'll never believe what happened. There's a new company called Meridian Solutions that's hiring people from Marcus's old industry. They specifically reached out to him about a position that would be even better than his old job. That's wonderful news, I said, though of course I already knew about Meridian Solutions, since I'd created it specifically for this purpose. What's the position? Operations Director, Elena said. It would mean a substantial raise and full benefits. But there's something strange about the interview process. They want him to write a detailed essay about a time when he misjudged someone and what he learned from the experience. And they want him to identify someone he wronged and explain how he would make amends. I had to bite my lip to keep from smiling. That does sound unusual. What does Marcus think about it? He's frustrated, Elena admitted. He thinks it's touchy-feely nonsense and that his work experience should speak for itself. But Victoria, we're desperate. I told him he needs to swallow his pride and write whatever they want to hear. That seems like sound advice, I said carefully. Sometimes humility is the price of opportunity. Could you maybe talk to him? Elena asked. You're so good with words, and you've always been wise about these things. Maybe you could help him figure out what to write. The request was delicious. Elena wanted me to help Marcus craft an apology to me, without realizing that I was the one who would ultimately judge whether his contrition was genuine. I'd be happy to help, I said. Why don't you have him call me this evening? Marcus called at 7:30, his voice stiff with reluctance. Elena says you might be able to help me with this essay thing for the job interview. I can certainly try, I said. What have you written so far? Nothing yet. I don't really understand what they're looking for. I mean, everyone makes mistakes in business. Why do they need some long emotional confession about personal stuff? Perhaps they want to understand your character, I suggested. Leadership positions require more than technical skills. They want to know how you handle adversity and whether you can learn from your mistakes. I guess, Marcus said grudgingly, but I can't think of any big mistakes I've made with people. I mean, sure, I've had personality conflicts with coworkers, but that's normal workplace stuff. I let the silence stretch, wondering if he would remember his behavior at Thanksgiving without prompting. When he didn't, I decided to nudge him in the right direction. What about family situations? I asked. Sometimes we act differently with family because we feel comfortable enough to let our guard down. Have you ever said something to a family member that you later regretted? Another long pause. Then, quietly, you mean like what I said to you at Thanksgiving? I wasn't necessarily thinking of that specific incident. I lied smoothly, but if that's something that's been on your mind, it might be worth exploring. I was stressed about work, Marcus said, the defensiveness clear in his voice. I didn't mean to take it out on you, but I was dealing with a lot of pressure and uncertainty. You know how it is. Do I? I asked. I'm not sure I understand what kind of pressure would cause someone to call a family member useless in front of 20 other people. The words hung in the air between us. Marcus cleared his throat uncomfortably. Look, I know I was out of line. I was drunk and stressed and I said things I shouldn't have said. But you have to understand. It's frustrating when you're working so hard to support your family, and it feels like other people are just coasting through life. Coasting through life, I repeated. Is that how you see me? Well, no, I mean, you're retired, right? You don't have the same pressures the rest of us have. You don't have to worry about supporting kids or making mortgage payments or dealing with demanding bosses. I was quiet for a long moment, considering how to respond. Marcus still had no idea that he was talking to the person who controlled his economic fate. He saw me as a financially comfortable widow without responsibilities, never suspecting that I managed a business empire that dwarfed his understanding. Marcus, I said finally, what if I told you that someone you considered useless was actually the reason you were able to live in your house for the past 2 years? What if that same person was indirectly responsible for your paycheck and your car loan, and many of the opportunities your family has had? I'd say that sounds pretty unlikely, Marcus replied with a forced laugh. I mean, no offense, Victoria, but what would you know about my job or my finances? More than you might think, I said quietly. But let's focus on your essay. The question is whether you can honestly examine your assumptions about people and acknowledge when you've been wrong. Okay, fine. I was wrong to call you useless. You're not useless. You're actually pretty helpful to the family. Is that what you want me to write? I want you to write what you actually believe, I said. If you're just saying words you think people want to hear, that's not genuine reflection. That's manipulation. Marcus was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Smaller. Victoria, can I ask you something? Of course. These past few months, with losing my job and the apartment and everything falling apart, it's made me think about things differently. About what's really important and who I can count on, and you've been the only person who's stayed supportive through all of this mess. How so? Well, you've been available when Elena needed to talk. You helped us look for apartments even though we couldn't afford the nice places. You didn't lecture us about financial planning or make us feel worse about our situation. You just listened and tried to help where you could. I found myself genuinely touched by his words, even though I knew I was the architect of his troubles. That's what family does for each other, Marcus. But that's just it, he said, his voice cracking slightly. I wasn't treating you like family at Thanksgiving. I was treating you like someone I had to tolerate. And then when everything went wrong, you were there for us anyway. That's not useless. That's the opposite of useless. For the first time since this whole revenge plot began, I felt a genuine pang of guilt. Marcus was starting to understand the lesson I'd been trying to teach, but he was learning it through suffering that I had deliberately inflicted. The question was whether that suffering had been necessary for his growth, or whether I had simply been indulging my own wounded pride. Tell me more about that, I said softly. I think I was jealous, Marcus admitted. You seemed so calm and stable while the rest of us were struggling with jobs and money and stress. It seemed unfair that you got to be peaceful while we were all fighting to survive. But I realize now that maybe your peace came from having your priorities straight. You cared more about relationships than about proving yourself or competing with people. The irony was overwhelming. Marcus was praising me for qualities that directly contradicted the ruthless business tactics I'd used to destroy his life. He was learning to value kindness and stability while I had been demonstrating calculation and power. What would you say to someone who had misjudged another person the way you misjudged me? I asked. I'd say that assumptions are dangerous, Marcus replied thoughtfully. I assumed you didn't contribute much because you weren't earning money or raising kids or doing the things I thought were important. But contribution isn't just about productivity. It's about being present for people and caring about their well-being and adding value to their lives in ways that maybe aren't obvious or measurable. He paused, then continued. I'd also say that calling someone useless is never okay, no matter how stressed you are or how much you've had to drink. That was cruel and unfair, and I'm ashamed of myself for saying it. And what would you do to make amends? I'd apologize sincerely and specifically. I'd acknowledge exactly what I did wrong and why it was harmful. And then I'd try to demonstrate through my actions that I'd learned from the mistake and become a better person because of it. I sat in my office, looking out at the garden David and I had planted together, feeling the weight of the decision I had to make. Marcus's words sounded genuine, but was he truly changed? Or was he simply saying what he thought would get him the job? And more importantly, did my motivations matter as much as the outcome? Marcus, I said, I want you to write your essay exactly as you've described it to me. Be honest about your assumptions, specific about your mistakes, and clear about what you've learned. Don't worry about whether it's what they want to hear. Focus on whether it's true. And you really think that will help me get the job? I think it will help you become the kind of person who deserves the job, I said. Whether you get it or not depends on factors beyond your control. After we hung up, I called Klaus to discuss the final phase of my plan. I want you to set up a meeting with Marcus Henderson for next week, I told him. But I want him to know that he's not just interviewing for a job. He's interviewing for a fresh start that includes housing assistance, debt consolidation, and a path back to financial stability. And what will you require from him in return? Honesty, I said. Complete honesty about who he is and what he's learned. And if he can demonstrate that, I want to offer him something even more valuable than a job. Which is the truth about who's been controlling his fate for the past 6 months. And then we'll see what kind of man he really is when he knows he's been talking to the person he called useless. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 2 p.m. in the downtown office I'd rented specifically for Meridian Solutions. I arrived early and arranged the conference room carefully. Marcus's essay sat on the table in front of me, along with a folder containing documentation of every action I'd taken to dismantle his life over the past 6 months. Marcus arrived precisely on time, wearing a suit that was probably borrowed, and shoes that had seen better days. The confidence and arrogance that had characterized him at Thanksgiving were gone, replaced by the humble demeanor of someone who knew he was getting a second chance he didn't deserve. Mr. Henderson, I said, gesturing for him to sit down, thank you for coming in today. I've reviewed your essay and I'd like to discuss it with you. Thank you for considering me, Marcus replied. I know the process has been unconventional, but I appreciate the opportunity to explain my qualifications and my growth. Let's start with your essay, I said, picking up the pages he'd submitted. You wrote about a time when you misjudged a family member and the lessons you learned from that experience. Can you elaborate on why you chose that particular incident? Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Well, it was the most significant example I could think of where my assumptions about someone were completely wrong. I made a cruel comment to my sister-in-law at a family gathering, calling her useless because I thought she wasn't contributing anything meaningful to our family. And what did you learn from that experience? That contribution comes in many forms, and that just because someone's value isn't obvious or measurable doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I also learned that my stress and frustration don't justify hurting other people, especially people who care about me. I studied his face carefully, looking for signs of insincerity or calculation. What I saw instead was genuine remorse and a humility that seemed born from real suffering and reflection. Marcus, I said quietly, what would you say if I told you that the sister-in-law you wrote about was the person sitting across from you right now? The color drained from his face. His mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. Victoria? You're Victoria? But how are you here? What is this? This is Meridian Solutions, I said calmly. A a company I created specifically to offer you the opportunity to rebuild your career and your life. But first, I needed to know whether you were capable of genuine growth, and whether your apology was sincere." Marcus stared at me in shock, his mind clearly racing to process what he was hearing. "You created this company, but that means you're the one who's been offering me this job. Which means you're not just some widow living off her husband's life insurance. You're actually quite wealthy, yes, successful in business, definitely, and far from useless, as I think recent events have demonstrated." "Recent events," Marcus repeated slowly. Then understanding began to dawn in his eyes. "Oh my God, the contracts at my company. The apartment. The car loan. That was all you, wasn't it?" "What do you think?" I asked. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his face cycling through a range of emotions: shock, anger, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like admiration. "You destroyed my entire life because I called you useless at Thanksgiving dinner. I demonstrated exactly how much influence a supposedly useless person could have over your circumstances," I corrected. "The question now is what you choose to do with that knowledge." "What I choose to do?" Marcus's voice was rising. "You systematically ruined everything I had built. My job, my home, my credit, my brother's business. You put my family through months of hell for the sake of proving a point." "And what point was that?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his anger warring with the recognition that his situation wasn't entirely my fault. "That I shouldn't have judged you without knowing who you really were. That I shouldn't have dismissed you as irrelevant when you were actually more powerful than anyone at that table." "Is that the only lesson here?" "No," Marcus said quietly. "The lesson is that I shouldn't have been cruel to you regardless of your circumstances. Even if you had been exactly what I thought you were, a widow living modestly off her husband's insurance, that still wouldn't have justified calling you useless in front of our entire family." I nodded slowly. "Now we're getting to the heart of it." "But Victoria," Marcus continued, his voice stronger now, "what you did to teach me that lesson was ruthless. You didn't just humble me. You devastated my family. Elena didn't deserve to lose her home. Bradley didn't deserve to lose his business. You punished innocent people to get back at me." He was right, and I'd been wrestling with that moral complexity for weeks. "You're absolutely correct," I said. "My methods were disproportionate to your offense, and other people suffered for your mistakes. That's on me, and I take full responsibility for those choices." "So what happens now?" Marcus asked. "Do you offer me this job as some kind of twisted consolation prize? Do I have to grovel and thank you for giving back a fraction of what you took away?" "What happens now depends entirely on what kind of person you want to be going forward," I said. "I can offer you a position with Meridian Solutions that would restore your financial stability and provide opportunities for advancement. I can also help your family get back on their feet and assist Bradley in restarting his business." "And in exchange?" "Nothing," I said. "No groveling required, no ongoing humiliation. Just the understanding that actions have consequences, and that the people you dismiss as irrelevant might be more significant than you realize." Marcus stared at me for a long time, clearly trying to process the surreal turn his life had taken. "Why?" he finally asked. "If you're willing to help us recover, why did you tear us down in the first place? Why not just tell me who you were at Thanksgiving and let me apologize then?" "Because an apology motivated by fear of consequences isn't the same as an apology motivated by genuine remorse," I said. "I needed to know whether you were capable of real growth, or whether you were just good at saying what people wanted to hear." "And what's your conclusion?" "I think you're a fundamentally decent person who lost sight of what matters," I said. "I think the suffering you've experienced over the past 6 months has taught you things about empathy and humility that you couldn't have learned any other way. And I think you're ready to be the kind of man your family needs you to be." Marcus was quiet for several minutes, his head in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red, but his voice was steady. "I want to accept your offer," he said. "Not because I think I deserve it, but because my family needs stability, and I need the chance to prove that I've learned from this experience." "I was hoping you'd say that," I said, sliding a folder across the table. These are the employment contracts and benefit packages for you and several other former Henderson Industrial employees. I've also included documentation for housing assistance and financial counseling services. Marcus opened the folder and scanned the contents, his eyes widening as he processed the generous terms. "This is more than generous," he said. "This is life-changing." "Everyone deserves a second chance," I said. "But Marcus, this is your second chance. There won't be a third one. If you revert to the arrogant, judgmental person you were before, you'll find yourself right back where you started, and I won't be inclined to help again." "I understand," Marcus said solemnly. "And Victoria, I want you to know that everything I said about learning from my mistakes, about understanding what's really important, that's all true. I'm not the same person who insulted you at Thanksgiving." "I believe you," I said. "And I'm looking forward to seeing who you become moving forward." As Marcus left the office that day, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this point. My revenge had been comprehensive and devastating, but it had also created an opportunity for genuine growth and redemption. The question was whether the lesson would stick, or whether Marcus would gradually forget the humility he'd learned through adversity. 6 months later, I had my answer. Marcus had thrived in his new position, demonstrating the kind of leadership and empathy that suggested his transformation was genuine. More importantly, he had used his experience to become an advocate for others who were struggling, creating mentorship programs and support networks for employees facing financial difficulties. At our next family Thanksgiving, hosted once again at my home, Marcus stood up during the gratitude portion of the evening. "I want to thank Victoria," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Not just for the opportunities she's provided, but for teaching me that a person's worth isn't measured by their productivity or their circumstances. It's measured by their character and their impact on the people around them." He looked directly at me as he continued. "I learned the hard way that the person I thought was contributing the least to our family was actually contributing the most. And I'm grateful every day for the chance to rebuild our relationship and to be a better man because of what she taught me." The room erupted in applause, but I was focused on the genuine emotion in Marcus's voice and the way Elena was wiping tears from her eyes. The revenge was complete, but more importantly, the redemption was real. The following Monday morning, I received an unexpected phone call that would complicate my carefully orchestrated plans. Dr. Rebecca Martinez from Chicago Memorial Hospital was calling about my mother-in-law Ruth, who had been admitted with chest pains during the night. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm afraid Mrs. Patterson is in serious condition," Dr. Martinez explained. "She's had a mild heart attack, and while she's stable now, she's asking specifically for you. She says there's something important she needs to discuss." I drove to the hospital with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Ruth had always been the matriarch of the Henderson family, a sharp-tongued woman who commanded respect through sheer force of personality. She was also one of the people who had sat silently while Marcus humiliated me at Thanksgiving, offering no defense or support. I found Ruth in the cardiac unit, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. The monitors surrounding her bed beeped rhythmically, and her usually perfectly styled silver hair was disheveled against the white pillows. "Victoria," she said, her voice weaker than usual but still carrying that familiar authoritative tone. "Thank you for coming. Close the door, please. We need to talk privately." I did as she asked, and pulled a chair closer to her bed. "How are you feeling, Ruth? The doctor said you're stable, but this must have been frightening." "Frightening enough to make me think about things I should have said years ago," Ruth replied, her sharp blue eyes studying my face intently. "Victoria, I know what you've been doing to Marcus and the family." My blood ran cold, but I kept my expression neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Don't insult my intelligence," Ruth said with a weak smile. "I didn't become a successful businesswoman by being naive about financial manipulation. I've been watching the systematic destruction of my grandson's life, and the timing was far too convenient to be coincidental." I remained silent, unsure how much Ruth actually knew versus how much she was guessing. The contracts that disappeared from Henderson Industrial all traced back to shell companies, Ruth continued. The rental property that suddenly became unavailable belonged to a trust with very creative ownership structures. Even Bradley's consulting clients seemed to evaporate through entities that don't quite exist in any meaningful way. That sounds like a series of unfortunate business circumstances, I said carefully. Victoria, I spent 40 years building Patterson Enterprises before I retired and handed control to David. I know how offshore holdings work, and I know how to make someone's life fall apart without leaving fingerprints. The question is whether you realize what you've stepped into. Ruth's words hit me like a physical blow. Patterson Enterprises had been David's company, but I'd always assumed he'd built it himself. The idea that Ruth had been the original architect of the business empire I'd inherited changed everything about our family dynamics. I don't understand, I said slowly. Of course you don't, Ruth said, pressing the button to raise her bed slightly. David never told you the truth about where the money came from, did he? He let you believe he was some kind of self-made entrepreneur who built his fortune through hard work and smart investments. My mind was racing, trying to process this revelation. What are you saying? I'm saying that everything you've been using to destroy Marcus's life originally belonged to me. Patterson Enterprises, the offshore accounts, the web of shell companies and international holdings, all of it. I built that empire over 4 decades, and when I retired 15 years ago, I transferred control to David with the understanding that it would eventually pass to the next generation. But David left everything to me, I said, feeling increasingly confused and defensive. Because he was supposed to, Ruth replied. Because that was always the plan. You were supposed to be the bridge between my generation and Marcus's generation. The money was supposed to flow through you to the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, ensuring the family's security for generations to come. I stared at Ruth, trying to reconcile this new information with everything I thought I knew about my life with David. Why didn't anyone tell me this? Because David thought you'd feel burdened by the responsibility, Ruth said. He wanted you to enjoy your marriage without feeling like you were just a custodian of family wealth. But he also assumed you'd naturally include the extended family in major financial decisions, especially after he was gone. Include them how? Well, certainly not by systematically destroying their livelihoods when they hurt your feelings, Ruth said with a sharp look. Victoria, what Marcus said to you was inexcusable, but your response has been nuclear. You've used family resources to wage war against family members. I felt a flush of anger and embarrassment. Family members who treated me like I was worthless and expendable. Family members who took my generosity for granted while mocking me behind my back. And you think David would approve of how you've handled that situation? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized I didn't have a good answer. David had been gentle and diplomatic, always looking for ways to bring people together rather than drive them apart. He would have been horrified by the calculated cruelty of my revenge plan. Ruth, I need to understand something, I said. If you built Patterson Enterprises and you know what I've been doing, why haven't you stopped me? You could have called off the contracts yourself or warned Marcus about what was happening. Ruth smiled, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of the formidable woman who had built a business empire from nothing. Because Marcus needed to learn the lesson you were teaching him. That boy has been arrogant and entitled his entire life, riding on the family's success, without understanding how precarious security can be. You showed him that his comfortable life was built on foundations he didn't control or understand. So you approve of what I did? I approve of the lesson, Ruth said carefully. I don't approve of the deception or the extent of the damage. You could have taught him humility without destroying his credit or making his family homeless. You chose the most brutal path possible when gentler options were available. I looked down at my hands, feeling the weight of Ruth's judgment. I was angry. I felt betrayed and dismissed, and I wanted him to understand what it felt like to be powerless. And now he does, Ruth said. The question is what you do with that knowledge. Do you continue punishing him indefinitely, or do you help him rebuild and become the man he's capable of being? I've already offered him a position with Meridian Solutions, I said. I'm not planning to keep him down permanently. But you're planning to keep him under your thumb, Ruth observed. You're planning to be the magnanimous benefactor who graciously allows him to recover from the devastation you caused. That's not mentorship, Victoria. That's control. Ruth's words stung because they contained more truth than I wanted to acknowledge. My plan to offer Marcus employment and assistance did come with strings attached. I would always know that his stability depended on my continued goodwill, and that knowledge would fundamentally alter our relationship forever. What would you suggest instead? I asked. Transfer control of Patterson Enterprises back to the family structure it was meant to have, Ruth said without hesitation. Create a board of directors that includes Marcus, Elena, Bradley, and the other grandchildren. Let them participate in the decisions that affect their lives, instead of being passive recipients of your judgment. And if they make bad decisions? If they prove they can't handle that kind of responsibility, then they'll learn from their mistakes, just like every generation before them has had to do. Victoria, you can't protect people from the consequences of their choices by making all their choices for them. That's not leadership, it's dictatorship. I sat quietly for several minutes, processing Ruth's suggestions and their implications. Sharing control of the family's financial resources would mean giving up the power that had allowed me to orchestrate my revenge. It would also mean trusting people who had proven themselves capable of cruelty and selfishness. Ruth, there's something else I need to understand, I said finally. When Marcus called me useless at Thanksgiving, why didn't you say anything? You were sitting right there, and you let him humiliate me in front of the entire family. Ruth's expression softened, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely remorseful. Because I was a coward, she admitted. Because I didn't want to get involved in family drama, and because I thought you were strong enough to handle Marcus's nonsense without my intervention. But you knew what he was saying was wrong? Of course I knew it was wrong. I also knew you controlled more wealth and had more business acumen than everyone else at that table combined. But I thought your confidence in yourself would be enough to weather his insults without needing public defense from me. It wasn't, I said quietly. It hurt more than I expected it to, and it made me feel invisible and unimportant. I'm sorry, Ruth said, and I could hear the sincerity in her voice. I should have spoken up immediately. I should have put Marcus in his place and made it clear that his behavior was unacceptable. My silence enabled his cruelty, and I regret that. The apology meant more to me than I'd anticipated. Ruth's failure to defend me had been almost as painful as Marcus's original insult, because it suggested that even the family matriarch saw me as expendable. Thank you for saying that, I said. It helps to know that you recognized how wrong the situation was. Victoria, I want to make you an offer, Ruth said, reaching for my hand with her frail fingers. I want to help you transition Patterson Enterprises into a true family trust, with proper governance and shared decision-making. I want to help you create something that brings the family together, instead of giving one person the power to tear it apart. Why would you trust me with that kind of transition after what I've done to Marcus? Because what you did to Marcus proves you understand the power you're wielding, Ruth replied. Someone who doesn't understand that power is dangerous in a different way. You've demonstrated that you can be ruthless when provoked, which means you'll also be taken seriously when you're trying to be collaborative. Ruth's proposal was intriguing, but it also felt like giving up the very thing that had allowed me to seek justice for Marcus's behavior. What if the family makes decisions I disagree with? What if they want to spend money on things I think are wasteful or harmful? Then you'll have to learn to live with decisions that aren't entirely under your control, Ruth said. Just like everyone else in the world has to do. Victoria, absolute power corrupts, absolutely, and you've already gotten a taste of how seductive that corruption can be. She was right, and I knew it. The past 6 months had shown me how intoxicating it could be to control other people's lives, to be the hidden force shaping their destinies. But that power had also isolated me and turned me into someone I wasn't sure I wanted to be. If I agree to this transition, I said slowly, I want some conditions. I want Marcus to complete his employment with Meridian Solutions successfully. I want him to demonstrate that he's learned from this experience before he gets a vote in family financial decisions. That seems reasonable, Ruth agreed. What else? I want a formal apology from everyone who was present at Thanksgiving and said nothing while Marcus attacked me. Not because I want to humiliate them, but because I need to know they understand that their silence was hurtful. Also reasonable? Anything else? I want the family to understand exactly what Patterson Enterprises is and how it works. No more pretending that David was the self-made millionaire who built everything. from scratch. If they're going to participate in controlling this wealth, they need to understand its history and their responsibility to preserve it. Ruth smiled, and I could see some of her old strength returning. Now you're thinking like the family matriarch you were meant to be. Over the next several weeks, Ruth and I worked together to design a new governance structure for Patterson Enterprises. It was complicated work, requiring legal expertise from multiple jurisdictions and careful consideration of tax implications. But it was also oddly healing. Working with Ruth gave me insight into the woman who had built the empire I'd inherited, and I gained tremendous respect for her intelligence and strategic thinking. The family meetings we held to explain the new structure were awkward at first. Marcus was still processing the revelation that I'd been behind his financial downfall, and the other family members were struggling to understand their new roles and responsibilities. But gradually, as we worked through the details together, something unexpected began to happen. We started functioning like an actual family again. Elena proved to have excellent instincts for risk management, catching potential problems in investment strategies that the rest of us had missed. Bradley, despite his previous business failures, had creative ideas for new ventures that could expand the family's portfolio. Even cousin Margaret contributed valuable insights about property management and development. Marcus took longer to find his footing in this new dynamic. He was still adjusting to his position at Meridian Solutions and processing the emotional complexity of working for the woman he'd insulted. But slowly, he began to demonstrate the leadership qualities that had made him successful before his world fell apart. The formal apology session was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in March, exactly 6 months after the Thanksgiving incident that had started everything. I had insisted that it take place in the same dining room where Marcus had called me useless, because I wanted to reclaim that space and those memories. One by one, each family member who had been present that day stood up and acknowledged their failure to defend me. Some of the apologies were more sincere than others, but they all contained a recognition that their silence had been complicity. When it was Marcus's turn, he spoke for nearly 10 minutes about the assumptions he'd made, the cruelty he'd displayed, and the lessons he'd learned through losing everything he'd taken for granted. His words were thoughtful and specific, demonstrating real reflection rather than empty platitudes. "Victoria," he concluded, "I can't undo the pain I caused you, and I can't erase the months of suffering my family endured because of my arrogance. But I can promise you that I'm not the same person who spoke those words 6 months ago. I've learned to value things I used to take for granted, and I've learned to see people as they really are instead of making assumptions based on limited information." After Marcus finished speaking, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then Ruth, who had been discharged from the hospital but was still recovering, raised her glass of water and a toast. "To second chances," she said simply, "and to the family we're going to become instead of the family we used to be." Everyone raised their glasses, and I felt something shift in the room. The anger and resentment that had driven my actions for 6 months were finally beginning to fade, replaced by something that felt like hope. But the real test of our family's transformation came 2 months later, when Bradley presented a business proposal that would require a significant investment from Patterson Enterprises. His previous ventures had failed spectacularly, and several family members were hesitant to risk family money on another of his projects. The old me would have simply vetoed the proposal and moved on. The new family structure required us to debate the merits and reach a consensus through discussion rather than decree. "Bradley's track record is concerning," Marcus said during the family board meeting. "But his analysis of the market opportunity seems sound, and he's addressed most of the issues that caused his previous failures. The risk-to-reward ratio is actually quite favorable," Elena added, reviewing the financial projections. "Even if the venture only achieves half of its projected returns, we'd still see a profit within 3 years. I found myself in the unusual position of being just one voice among many, and I had to make my arguments based on merit rather than authority. It was frustrating at times, but it was also oddly liberating. The burden of making all the decisions alone had been heavier than I'd realized. After 2 hours of discussion, we voted to approve Bradley's proposal with some modifications to reduce risk. It wasn't the decision I would have made unilaterally, but it was a decision we'd reached together as a family. 6 months later, Bradley's business was exceeding its projected returns, and he had become one of the most valuable contributors to our family board meetings. The experience taught me that shared decision-making, while messier and more time-consuming than autocracy, often produced better outcomes because it incorporated diverse perspectives and expertise. The transformation of our family dynamics had ripple effects beyond just our financial arrangements. Marcus and Elena's marriage grew stronger as they worked through the stress of their financial crisis together. Bradley gained confidence and business acumen through his successful venture. Even the relationships with extended family members improved, as people felt more included and valued. But perhaps the most significant change was in my own sense of identity and purpose. For the first time since David's death, I felt like I belonged somewhere and contributed something meaningful to other people's lives. Instead of being the isolated widow who controlled everyone else's fate from behind the scenes, I was an active participant in a family enterprise that benefited everyone involved. The anniversary of my revenge plot's beginning arrived on a crisp October evening. I was in my garden, preparing the flower beds for winter, when Marcus appeared at my back gate. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, holding up a pair of gardening gloves. "Elena sent me over with some bulbs she thought you might like for next spring." We worked together in comfortable silence for a while, planting tulips and daffodils that would bloom long after the memory of our conflict had faded. It struck me that this quiet collaboration was worth more than all the dramatic confrontations and power plays of the previous year. "Victoria," Marcus said eventually, "I've been thinking about something Ruth said during one of our board meetings. About how the best revenge is living well and building something better than what existed before. What made you think of that?" "Looking at what we've accomplished together over the past year," Marcus replied, gesturing toward my house where warm light spilled from the windows. "A year ago, our family was fractured and dysfunctional. People were taking each other for granted and treating each other poorly. Now we're actually working together and supporting each other's goals. You think that's better than the satisfaction of personal revenge?" Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "I think personal revenge gives you a temporary feeling of justice, but building something constructive gives you a permanent feeling of purpose. What you did to me taught me important lessons, but what we've built together since then has taught me even more valuable ones." As we finished planting and cleaned our tools, I reflected on Marcus's words. My original plan had been focused entirely on making him suffer for his cruelty, but the aftermath had created opportunities for growth and connection that I never could have anticipated. The revenge had been satisfying in the moment, but the reconciliation and collaboration that followed had been fulfilling in a deeper and more lasting way. I had learned that true power wasn't the ability to control other people's lives, but the ability to create something valuable that benefited everyone involved. That night, as I prepared for bed in the house that no longer felt like a fortress under siege, I realized that my year of revenge had taught me more about myself than about the people I'd been trying to punish. I had discovered reserves of strength and cunning I didn't know I possessed, but I had also discovered the limitations of those qualities when used in isolation. The offshore accounts and shell companies that had enabled my revenge were still there, but they no longer felt like weapons waiting to be deployed. They were tools for building security and opportunity for the people I cared about, and that transformation in purpose had changed everything about how I saw myself and my role in the world. I fell asleep that night with a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since before David's death. The anger and hurt that had driven me for so many months had finally been replaced by something more constructive and sustainable. I was no longer the grieving widow seeking vengeance against an ungrateful family. I was a woman who had found her place in the world and was using her gifts to create something meaningful. The final chapter of my revenge story wasn't about destruction or punishment. It was about transformation and redemption, both for the people who had wronged me and for myself. And that, I realized, was a much better ending than anything I could have planned when the whole adventure began. 2 years after the Thanksgiving incident that changed everything, I stood in the boardroom of Henderson Enterprises, watching my family argue about the future direction of our international expansion. The debate was heated but respectful, with Marcus advocating for conservative growth while Bradley pushed for more aggressive market penetration. Elena was running numbers on her laptop, occasionally interjecting with risk assessments that kept the discussion grounded in reality. It was exactly the kind of family business meeting I had never imagined possible during those dark months when I was systematically destroying Marcus's life. The transformation had been so complete that newcomers to our board meetings would never guess the history of manipulation and revenge that had brought us to this point. The European markets are showing strong indicators for luxury goods, Bradley was saying, pulling up charts on the conference room screen. If we establish a presence now, we could capture significant market share before our competitors catch up. The political instability in 3 of our target countries makes that a risky proposition, Marcus countered. I'm not saying we should avoid expansion, but we need to be strategic about timing and placement. I listened to their exchange with a mixture of pride and amazement. These were the same people who had been financial basket cases just 2 years ago, now conducting sophisticated analysis of international business opportunities. The growth in their capabilities had exceeded even my most optimistic projections. "What's your instinct, Victoria?" Ruth asked from her position at the head of the table. At 82, she had reclaimed her role as family matriarch with enthusiasm, though she now shared decision-making authority rather than wielding it autocratically. "I think we split the difference," I said after considering both proposals. "We move forward with expansion, but we start with the 2 most stable markets and see how those perform before committing to the riskier territories." The family voted unanimously to adopt my suggestion, and I felt the familiar satisfaction of collaborative decision-making. It was different from the rush of unilateral control I had experienced during my revenge phase, but it was more sustainable and ultimately more rewarding. After the meeting ended and everyone else had left, Ruth lingered behind to discuss a matter that had been on both our minds for weeks. "Victoria, we need to talk about succession planning," she said, settling back into her chair with the deliberate movements of someone managing chronic pain. "I'm not going to be around forever, and this family needs to be prepared for the transition." "You're talking like you're dying tomorrow," I said, though I knew her concerns were valid. Ruth had been dealing with heart problems since her hospitalization, and while she was managing them well, the reality of mortality was never far from our conversations. "I'm talking like someone who's lived long enough to know that unexpected things happen," Ruth replied. "David's sudden death taught us that lesson. We can't assume we'll have time to plan for every contingency." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that you need to start thinking of yourself as my successor," Ruth said bluntly. "You're the one with the most comprehensive understanding of our holdings. You're the one with the temperament for strategic thinking, and you're the one the family trusts to make difficult decisions." The idea of becoming the official head of Patterson Enterprises was both thrilling and terrifying. I had grown comfortable with shared leadership, but ultimate responsibility was a different kind of burden. "What about Marcus?" I asked. "He's shown tremendous growth, and he has strong leadership skills." "Marcus has grown tremendously," Ruth agreed. "But he doesn't have your experience with the international aspects of our business, and he doesn't have your instinct for reading people and situations. He's an excellent operations manager, but you're a natural strategist." "And Bradley? Elena? Both valuable contributors, but neither has the combination of skills needed for overall leadership. Victoria, you've been functioning as my de facto successor for months now. This would just formalize what's already happening." I walked to the window overlooking the Chicago skyline, considering Ruth's proposal and its implications. Accepting formal leadership of Patterson Enterprises would mean taking responsibility for the financial security of dozens of family members and hundreds of employees. It would also mean permanently stepping away from the quiet, anonymous life I had lived before David's death. "There's something I need to tell you," I said, turning back to face Ruth. "Something about the revenge I took on Marcus that I've never shared with anyone." Ruth raised an eyebrow but remained silent, waiting for me to continue. "I enjoyed it," I admitted. "Not just the justice of teaching him a lesson, but the power itself. The ability to control his life, to watch him struggle, and know that I was the cause of his problems. It was intoxicating in a way that scared me." "And you're worried that formal leadership would reawaken those impulses?" "I'm worried that having that much power over people's lives might corrupt me again," I said. "I'm worried that I might start using authority to settle personal scores instead of serving the family's best interests." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, her sharp eyes studying my face. "Victoria, do you know why I think you're the right person for this role?" "Why?" "Because you're the only person in this family who understands how dangerous power can be," Ruth said. Someone who's never been tempted by absolute authority is more likely to abuse it when they get it. Someone who's experienced that temptation and learned to resist it is much safer. But what if I don't resist it next time? What if someone hurts me or threatens the family, and I decide to use Patterson resources for personal vengeance again? Then the family board will remove you from leadership, Ruth said matter-of-factly. We're not talking about making you an absolute monarch, Victoria. We're talking about giving you executive authority within a system of checks and balances. Ruth's words were reassuring, but I still felt the weight of potential responsibility. Can I think about it? Of course. But don't think too long. The family needs stability, and uncertainty about succession creates instability. That evening, I called my old friend Sarah Mitchell in the Cayman Islands to discuss Ruth's proposal and its legal implications. Congratulations, Sarah said after I explained the situation. This is quite an honor, and frankly, it's about time. You've been doing the work of family leadership for years now. I'm not sure I'm ready for the formal responsibility, I confessed. There's something about having official authority that feels different from collaborative decision-making. Victoria, you've already proven you can handle that level of responsibility, Sarah pointed out. Look at how you managed the Marcus situation. Yes, you made some questionable choices initially, but you also recognized those mistakes and corrected course. That's exactly the kind of mature leadership a family enterprise needs. What if I make worse mistakes with more power? What if you make better decisions with more authority to implement them? Sarah countered. Victoria, you've spent the last 2 years learning to work within a collaborative framework. You're not the same person who went nuclear on Marcus for insulting you. You're someone who's learned to balance personal feelings with institutional responsibilities. After we ended the call, I spent the rest of the evening walking through my house and garden, thinking about the path that had brought me to this crossroads. 2 years ago, I had been a grieving widow who felt invisible and undervalued by her own family. The revenge I had taken was born from pain and anger, but it had also revealed capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. The question now was whether I could use those capabilities constructively rather than destructively. Whether I could be the kind of leader who built things up rather than tearing them down. The next morning, I called Marcus and asked if we could meet for lunch. I wanted to get his perspective on Ruth's succession proposal, partly because his opinion mattered to me, and partly because I needed to understand how he would react to being passed over for family leadership. We met at a quiet restaurant downtown, far enough from the Patterson offices that we could speak freely without worrying about being overheard by other family members. Ruth told me about her proposal, Marcus said after we'd ordered. I think it's exactly the right decision. You're not disappointed about not being considered for the role yourself? Marcus laughed, but it was a warm sound rather than a bitter one. Victoria, 2 years ago I thought I understood business because I could manage a mid-level manufacturing operation. Working with you and the family board has taught me how much I didn't know about strategy, international finance, and long-term planning. I'm good at what I do, but you're operating on a completely different level. I appreciate that, but I want to make sure you're being honest with me. This is a lot of authority to concentrate in one person's hands. It is, Marcus agreed. But it's also authority you've already been exercising informally. Making it official would actually create more accountability, not less, because you'd have defined responsibilities and oversight mechanisms. And you don't think I'd abuse that authority the way I did when I was destroying your life? Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering his response carefully. Victoria, what you did to me was wrong in terms of methods, but it wasn't wrong in terms of motivation. You weren't trying to hurt me for personal gain or amusement. You were trying to teach me a lesson that I desperately needed to learn. That doesn't justify the extremity of my response. No, it doesn't, Marcus said. But it does demonstrate that even when you were acting from anger and hurt, you still had limits and boundaries. You didn't try to destroy me permanently. You created a path for redemption and growth. That suggests someone who can be trusted with power because you understand its proper use. What if someone else in the family challenges my authority or tries to undermine my decisions? What if I'm tempted to use Patterson resources to retaliate against them? Then I'll remind you of this conversation, Marcus said with a smile. And I'll remind you that the person who taught me about accountability and consequences should be willing to accept those same principles for herself. His words carried weight because they came from someone who had experienced both my capacity for destruction and my capacity for mercy. If Marcus believed I could handle family leadership responsibly, that belief meant something significant. That afternoon, I met with Elena to get her perspective on the succession question. As someone who had been indirectly affected by my revenge against Marcus, her opinion was particularly important to me. I've been wondering when Ruth would finally make this official, Elena said when I explained the situation. You've been functioning as the family leader for months now. Formalizing it just makes sense. But you've seen what I'm capable of when I feel wronged, I pointed out. Doesn't that concern you? It concerns me less than the alternative, Elena replied. Victoria, you didn't destroy Marcus's life because you enjoyed causing pain. You did it because you felt that justice required consequences for his behavior. That's actually the kind of moral reasoning I want in a family leader. Even if my methods were extreme? Your methods were extreme because you were operating in isolation, Elena said. As official family leader, you wouldn't be operating in isolation. You'd have the board to provide perspective and the formal structure to channel your decisions through appropriate processes. And you think that structure would prevent me from acting on personal grievances? I think that structure would force you to justify your decisions to other people, which would naturally moderate any extreme impulses, Elena explained. The revenge you took on Marcus was possible because you were operating in secret. Family leadership operates in the open. Elena's analysis was persuasive, but I still had concerns about accepting such a significant role. That evening, I called Bradley to get his thoughts on the succession proposal. About time, was his immediate response. Victoria, you've been the de facto leader of this family since Ruth's heart attack. Making it official just acknowledges what everyone already knows. You don't think I might be tempted to abuse that authority? I think you're the only person in this family who's demonstrated the ability to use power effectively, Bradley said. Look at what you accomplished with Meridian Solutions. You created something that benefited everyone involved, including the people you were initially trying to punish. But that came after I had systematically destroyed Marcus's life. And that experience taught you important lessons about the responsible use of power, Bradley pointed out. Victoria, the difference between a good leader and a dangerous one isn't whether they've ever made mistakes. It's whether they learn from those mistakes and develop better judgment. What if I make different mistakes with more authority? Then you'll learn from those mistakes too, Bradley said simply, and the family will survive them, just like we survived the Marcus situation. The important thing is having leadership that's accountable and willing to grow. By the end of that week, I had spoken with every major family member about Ruth's succession proposal. The consensus was unanimous. They wanted me to accept formal leadership of Patterson Enterprises. More importantly, they trusted me to exercise that leadership responsibly. The formal transition ceremony took place on a Saturday morning in November, exactly 2 years after the Thanksgiving dinner that had started my journey toward family leadership. Ruth had insisted on making it a celebration, rather than a somber transfer of authority. Today marks the beginning of a new chapter for Patterson Enterprises, Ruth said to the assembled family members and key employees. Victoria has demonstrated the vision, integrity, and strategic thinking necessary to guide our family's interests into the future. As Ruth handed me the symbolic keys to the executive offices, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. But it was a different kind of weight than I had expected. Instead of feeling burdened, I felt energized by the possibilities ahead. My first major decision as official family leader came just 2 weeks later, when we received an acquisition offer from a multinational corporation that wanted to purchase Patterson Enterprises outright. The offer was substantial enough to make every family member independently wealthy, but it would also mean the end of our family business legacy. This is exactly the kind of decision that defines a leadership tenure, Ruth said when I called to discuss the offer. How you handle this will set the tone for everything that follows. I spent 3 days analyzing the proposal with our financial advisors and legal team. The numbers were attractive, but something about the acquiring company's business practices bothered me. They had a history of purchasing family businesses, extracting maximum short-term value, and then dissolving the original company culture. When I presented my recommendation to the family board, I could see the tension in the room. Several members were clearly attracted to the financial benefits of accepting the offer. "The monetary terms are excellent," I began, "but I believe accepting this offer would be a mistake for our family's long-term interests." "Can you explain your reasoning?" Marcus asked, though I could see in his expression that he agreed with my assessment. "Patterson Enterprises represents more than just financial assets," I said. "It represents 4 decades of work by Ruth, continued by David, and now by all of us. Selling to this particular buyer would destroy that legacy in exchange for short-term gain." "But the money would secure everyone's future," Cousin Margaret pointed out. "Isn't financial security more important than sentimental attachment to a business?" "Financial security is important," I agreed. "But this business provides ongoing financial security for multiple generations. Selling it provides financial security for one generation at the expense of all future generations." The debate continued for nearly 2 hours, with family members weighing the certainty of immediate wealth against the potential for long-term prosperity. In the end, the vote was close but decisive. We would decline the acquisition offer and continue building the family business. As I watched the family members file out of the boardroom after the meeting, I realized that this decision had been a test of my leadership philosophy. I could have recommended accepting the offer and securing immediate financial benefits for everyone. Instead, I had advocated for the harder path that required continued work and commitment. The fact that the family had trusted my judgment and voted to support my recommendation felt like validation of Ruth's confidence in my leadership abilities. Over the following months, my leadership style evolved as I gained experience with the formal authority of my position. I learned to delegate more effectively, trusting other family members to handle responsibilities they were capable of managing. I also learned to seek input more systematically, creating regular forums for family members to contribute ideas and feedback. But perhaps most importantly, I learned to separate personal feelings from business decisions in a way I hadn't been able to do during the Marcus incident. When conflicts arose between family members, I focused on finding solutions that served the family's collective interests, rather than taking sides based on personal relationships. The first major test of this new approach came when Bradley's successful business venture began competing with one of our existing subsidiaries. The competition was creating internal tension and raising questions about conflicts of interest within the family structure. "We need to address this situation before it damages family relationships," Elena said during a private meeting in my office. "Bradley's success is wonderful, but it's creating problems for the industrial division." "What kind of problems specifically?" "Loss of market share, pressure on profit margins, and resentment among the employees who feel like they're being undermined by family favoritism," Elena explained. "The industrial division managers are starting to question whether they can succeed when they're competing against family-funded ventures." The situation was exactly the kind of personal versus business conflict that could have triggered my old destructive impulses. 2 years ago, I might have seen Bradley's success as disloyalty to the family enterprise and taken steps to undermine his venture. Instead, I scheduled a family board meeting to address the conflict openly and collaboratively. "We have a structural problem that requires a structural solution," I told the assembled family members. "Bradley's business success is creating complications for our existing operations, and we need to resolve this in a way that's fair to everyone involved." "What kind of resolution are you considering?" Bradley asked, clearly concerned about the implications for his business. "I'm considering several options," I replied. "We could purchase your business and integrate it into our existing operations. We could establish clear market boundaries to minimize direct competition, or we could help you expand into different markets that don't overlap with our current interests." "What's your preference?" Ruth asked. "My preference is the solution that best serves the family's long-term interests while respecting everyone's contributions and investments," I said. "I don't think personal relationships should override business logic, but I also don't think business logic should override family loyalty." After extensive discussion and analysis, we decided to purchase Bradley's business at fair market value and integrate it into our operations as a new division. Bradley would continue running the business as a division head with expanded authority and resources. The solution satisfied everyone involved and demonstrated that family conflicts could be resolved through systematic analysis rather than emotional manipulation. More importantly, it showed that I had learned to use my leadership authority to bring people together rather than drive them apart. As my first year as official family leader drew to a close, I reflected on how much had changed since the Thanksgiving dinner that had triggered my journey toward revenge and eventual redemption. The family that had once been characterized by taking each other for granted now operated as a cohesive team focused on shared goals. Marcus had evolved from an arrogant middle manager into a thoughtful operations director who understood the value of collaboration. Elena had developed from a silent observer into an active contributor with valuable analytical skills. Bradley had grown from a failed entrepreneur into a successful business leader who understood how to balance personal ambition with family loyalty. But perhaps the most significant transformation had been my own evolution, from a grieving widow seeking revenge to a family leader focused on building something lasting and meaningful. The power that had once corrupted me with its potential for destruction had become a tool for creation and growth. On the second anniversary of the Thanksgiving incident, I hosted another family dinner in the same dining room where Marcus had called me useless. But this time, the conversation focused on gratitude for how far we had all come and excitement about the opportunities ahead. "I want to propose a toast," Marcus said, standing up with his wine glass. "To Victoria, who taught us all that strength comes not from avoiding challenges but from learning how to meet them with wisdom and grace." As I looked around the table at the faces of people who had become genuine partners in building something larger than any of us could have created alone, I realized that my revenge had ultimately created something far more valuable than the satisfaction of proving Marcus wrong. It had created a family legacy based on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and collaborative achievement. The offshore accounts and shell companies that had enabled my revenge were still there, but they now served as tools for opportunity creation rather than weapons of destruction. The power that had once isolated me now connected me to a network of relationships based on trust and shared purpose. I had learned that true strength wasn't the ability to control other people's lives, but the ability to inspire them to achieve things they hadn't thought possible. The woman who had been called useless had become the architect of her family's future, not through destruction and dominance, but through leadership and vision. As the evening wound down and family members began to leave, Ruth lingered behind to speak with me privately. "David would be proud of what you've accomplished," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Not just the business success, but the way you've brought this family together and given everyone a chance to contribute their best." "I hope so," I replied. "I hope he would understand that the revenge was necessary to teach the lessons, but that the reconciliation was what mattered most in the end. He would understand," Ruth assured me, "and he would appreciate that you learned to use power for creation rather than destruction." That night, as I prepared for bed in the house that had once felt like a fortress under siege, I realized that my story of revenge had become a story of redemption, not just for Marcus and the family members who had learned to value what they had taken for granted, but for myself as well. I had discovered that the most satisfying revenge wasn't destroying someone who had wronged me, but transforming both of us into better versions of ourselves. The woman Marcus had called useless had indeed been useless, but only because she hadn't yet found her purpose. Once I discovered that purpose, everything else had fallen into place. The offshore accounts would remain, the shell companies would continue their operations, and the family business would keep growing. But they would do so in service of building something meaningful rather than tearing something down. And that transformation, more than any temporary satisfaction from revenge, had given my life the meaning and purpose I had been searching for since David's death. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.